Very good afternoon to Dr. Suresh, a consultant ID physician from Singapore Hospital, and then our fellow colleagues who have joined us today. Okay. Today, I'm Dr. Arasu, the Honorary Secretary General of the Malaysian Medical Association, and on my right is Dr. Sivanesan. He is the Chairman of Private Practice Section of the Malaysian Medical Association. We both will be the moderators. And then before we start, probably just on the technical part, if you have any issues, you can put it in the chat box in the event that the video is not clear, audio is not clear. Okay. Otherwise, this entire webinar will be recorded. And then we're also sharing a Facebook Live in the MMA Facebook. And later, after this, we will also share in the MMA website for anyone, any of the doctors, irrespective of membership, to actually view it. Okay. And we would like to thank Dr. Suresh. I think everyone knows Dr. Suresh. No need any introduction. Okay, we would like to thank him again because last year, sometime in February, when COVID just started, he and Dr. Christopher Lee called us and informed us that the impending pandemic and also the importance for the GPs to be ready. So that is when first we came out with the infection prevention control with Singapore Hospital, how GPs should take care of themselves and prevent from getting infection with COVID-19 there and the staff. A very simple infographics was done, a video was done on that. And again, we received a call from Dr. Suresh on what the GPs must play an important role and to assist the country, especially in picking up cases. So that is why we're having the webinar here. And to everyone's information, Dr. Suresh has been updating us on a regular basis and then giving us various informations and also updates on how can we keep updated with the COVID-19 and manage at our own practices. Okay. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Suresh. Start the webinar. Dato'. Dato', you're muted.
Thank you, Dr. Arzu. Can you all hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, good. So I think what I wanted to highlight is regarding the importance of early detection of COVID-19. As you know, across the country now, we are starting to see patients coming in late, and people are ending up in our emergency departments requiring oxygen on admission. So initially, when the epidemic was not limited number of patients were infected, when initially we were able to do contact tracing and catch patients early, even before they could get symptoms. Currently, what's happening is majority of the patients that are being diagnosed as COVID positive are actually among the symptomatic group. They get symptoms, they seek medical care, and finally we detect them to be COVID positive, and then we admit into our settings. So it is increasingly becoming like dengue, you see. As we all know, in dengue, the importance of picking up GPs and primary care providers have a very important role of picking up dengue very early, because initially dengue is very non-specific. And of course, if you diagnose them late, then they end up in severe problems, and we have a lot more difficulty managing them. So I think COVID-19 has reached a stage that is very similar, and so we need to pick them up very early for ease of management. The second reason why we need to pick COVID-19 early is actually from the disease control perspective. I'll try and explain what this disease control perspective is, right? Okay, these are two studies that looks at the viral load of patients as detected by throat swabs and nasal swabs. As you can see here, I will explain CT values later, but CT values, lower the CT value, that means high viral load. High CT value means low viral load, right? And so as you can see here, in initial phases, the CT value is high, and as the disease progresses, CT value is low, that means the viral load is high. As time progresses, the CT value becomes higher and higher, that means the viral load becomes lower. Similarly, a different study that looking at PCR positive, as you can see here, this PCR positive specimens from nasal swabs. As you can see here, the PCR remains positive for a long time. But positive culture, as positive culture means a PCR that is the viruses that are still can transmit the disease. After day 8, it's no longer culture. Even though PCR is positive, it's no longer culture positive. So first thing is as evidenced by PCR, the PCR levels, COVID virus levels in the throat swabs and nasal swabs, the viral load drops dramatically as we go by, as the day of onset of symptoms increase. And even if the PCR is positive, culture positive virus is not there beyond day 8 of illness, right? Okay, so this is based on PCR values. This is based on culture results, and this is based on epidemiological studies in Taiwan. So epidemiological studies in Taiwan has shown that so if a patient is positive, they go back and do extensive contact tracing and try and find the contacts and test the contacts. So in that particular study, they've showed that if somebody comes in contact with a COVID positive patient, within 5 days of symptom onset, there is a 1% chance that the contacts become positive in that particular scenario in Taiwan. But after 5 days of symptom onset, even though they had 852 contacts, there was zero, nobody was actually COVID positive. That means early in the disease, if somebody comes in contact with a COVID positive patient early in the disease, there is a possibility they also get COVID. If they come in contact with a COVID positive patient later in the disease, they don't get COVID because the COVID is no longer transmissible, mainly because of the data I showed you earlier, right? There's also a very nice study in household in US where they went back and looked at all the patients who are diagnosed early, and they go back and look at their household contacts and try to find out when does the transmission to the household happen. And they again found out that 75% of the infections were identified within 5 days of index patient's illness onset, meaning if a person is positive, the person if he's going to transmit to 10 people, let's say, okay, he transmit to at least 7 or 8 of them before day 5 of illness. And so as you can realize now, if you pick up somebody as COVID positive after day 5 of illness and then isolate them, put them in a quarantine center or send them to hospitals, we are actually missing the boat. They have already transmitted the disease. So we really have to pick them up very early and isolate them early. Only then we can break the chain of transmission. And that's the reason why it is extremely important to pick up early infections. One word on asymptomatic transmission, because as I showed you, day 5 of illness or day 6 of illness, you can only pick up in a person who's got symptoms. If somebody's got asymptomatic throughout, you cannot pick up day of illness. But some data to say asymptomatic group of patients, there is a 42% lower chance of transmission compared to symptomatic person. And so there is asymptomatic person transmits 50% less efficiently compared to a symptomatic person. So that's why it's important that we pick up symptomatic persons early and isolate them early. Okay, but some people argue the other way around. You see, they say asymptomatic person is more likely to walk around the community than get isolated, and so they probably transmit more. And so the proportion of transmission by asymptomatic versus symptomatic in the country is unknown. But if you take an individual symptomatic person versus an asymptomatic person, the symptomatic person actually transmits more, and he transmits during the first 5 days of illness. Okay. So keeping that in mind, we have actually, the KKM has actually modified the case definition with regards to when do you test for COVID-19. And I'll just go through the latest case definition from KKM. So before that, I just want to point out to you that COVID-19 now we know has got varied presentation. It is just not fever and cough. It has got respiratory symptoms. It has got body ache and fatigue. It has got loss of taste and smell. It has got GI symptoms. So under respiratory symptoms, you can get cough, shortness of breath, difficulty in breathing, sore throat, congestion or running nose. The body ache and fatigue, you can get fatigue, muscle ache, body ache and headaches. Loss of taste and smell requires no further explanation. And then GI symptoms, nausea, vomiting and diarrhea. All this, any of this can be COVID-19 as we know now. So based on that, so KKM now says when do you suspect COVID? When you need to suspect COVID when you have an epidemiological criteria or a clinical criteria. So epidemiological criteria, at least in Klang Valley, it is easy to fill, right? And so residing or working in an area where there is high risk of transmission, residing or travel to an area where there's high risk of transmission, or working in a healthcare setting. All this is considered epidemiological criteria for COVID-19, right? So, so some of the other areas will be institutional settings, closed residential settings like hostels, also considered as high-risk areas for transmission. That is the epidemiological criteria. Moving on to clinical criteria, acute onset of fever and cough. So any guy who comes to us in Klang Valley with fever and cough now, we have to think of COVID-19 because everybody comes into to our clinics from Klang Valley is because the high-risk setting now fulfills the epidemiological criteria, and this is the clinical criteria now. So what about the other clinical criteria? Any two or more of the following: fever, cough, generalized weakness or fatigue, headache, myalgia, sore throat, coryza, dyspnea, anorexia, nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea, altered mental status. Any two of these that you get, then they fulfill the criteria for COVID-19 testing. And so, so I know some of you will grumble that is every single patient that is coming into my clinic, but that's how we're going to pick up all the COVID-19 patients, by having a very short threshold to do a COVID-19 test. And that's the reason why this criteria has been created. And so it is easy in a place where there is a lot of COVID-19 transmission happening. Any clinical symptom can be COVID-19. When is it a probable case? It's a probable case. Anybody who's positive RTK antigen test is considered a probable case. Anybody who's got a chest X-ray finding that looks like COVID-19, like they have ground glass opacities, then you think of probable. So anybody who fills the clinical criteria that I mentioned earlier, but he's a contact of a case, then he is considered probable. So so a contact of a confirmed case, and then he comes and gives you some clinical symptoms that I mentioned earlier, then he becomes probable COVID. Or he tells you I'm a part of a cluster, you know, a workplace cluster, let's say, and then he has got clinical symptoms. So clinical symptoms, part of a cluster, already part of a workplace cluster, then he becomes a probable case. Any person who comes with recent onset of loss of smell or loss of taste, then he becomes a probable case. Any death not otherwise explained due to respiratory distress and was a contact of a probable or confirmed case, also considered a probable case. So all these are considered probable COVID-19 now. When is it a confirmed COVID-19? Anybody alive or dead has got a COVID PCR positive is considered confirmed. In some situations, a positive RTK antigen itself is considered confirmed. When is it? When it happens in a locality where there is so much COVID-19. Let's say, for example, there is a workplace cluster, and many of the workers there are positive now, right? So in such a situation, so we now use more than 10%. More than 10% of the workers now are positive based on what we have tested so far in the last few days. If that is the case, then RTK antigen is confirmatory. You don't have to do a PCR to confirm this diagnosis. So sometimes what happens in our own setting, our EPID officer will tell us this person is RTK antigen positive, but he comes from an area where a lot of people are positive. Then we accept the RTK antigen as confirmatory and we don't do PCR tests. So that's regarding the case definition for COVID-19. Okay. Moving on, I will just briefly touch about some of the diagnostic tests that we have and how do we use them, right? As you already well aware, we have got molecular tests, we've got antigen tests, antibody tests, not very useful currently because antibodies take too long to come, and so I won't discuss about antibody tests in diagnosing COVID-19. So molecular tests and antigen tests. Molecular tests can be RT-PCR or isothermal amplification test called LAMP test. I think there are some LAMP tests available. Abbott now, a kit called Abbott now is actually a most popularly used LAMP test. But all of them test for RNA. All of them test for the RNA of the COVID-19 test. Okay. So for molecular tests, you can use nasal swabs, and also you can use saliva. While antigen tests for the nuclear protein. It doesn't test for the RNA, it tests for nuclear protein. And here you have to use only swab. Saliva is not allowed, right? And that's the two tests that are available, right? Okay. I just want to go through with you the performance of both these tests. As if this graph, this orange graph is a graph of the SARS-CoV-2 viral load if you keep on doing multiple nasal swabs. If you do multiple nasopharyngeal swabs frequently, and you check the viral load, this is what will happen. So as I mentioned earlier, there is an early peaking of the viral load, and later there is a long tail of the viral load, right? Okay, and you can divide it into incubation period, infectious period, and post-infectious period. So 3 periods that we have. During the infectious period, the viral load is extremely high, right? Okay. So PCR test has got high sensitivity. Antigen test has got a low sensitivity. And so antigen test picks up only when the viral load is at this level, while PCR picks it up when the viral load is at this level. Okay, even at lower levels, viral load. So PCR remains longer, positive longer. Antigen test remains positive shorter period of time. Okay. The first period that I want to talk about is incubation period, right? So the median incubation period is 5 to 6 days, but it can be as fast as 2 days or as late as 12 days. And so from the time the patient is exposed to the time the patient gets symptoms, that is the incubation period, right? Okay, so exposed to the time they get symptoms, so that's the incubation period. Okay, that is 5 to 6 days. It can go as early as 2 days and as late as 12 days, right? And so if you do a PCR at day 5 after exposure, so this is the exposure here, and you do after day 5 of exposure, 38% of them will be false negative. And if you do a PCR at day 8 of exposure, you will get 20% false negative. This is like the window period in HIV, right? So if you do it too early, even though the person is destined to get HIV, the HIV test is negative. And so we always have to remember this concept of incubation period. And so whenever you do a test, the test comes back as negative, you have to ask them, when was your exposure? And if your exposure was less than 10 days, you have to say, you have to repeat the test because you have done it too early. There is a possibility that's false negative. Okay. And so it is important that you have to remember incubation period when we interpret a negative COVID-19 test, right? Okay. I won't talk about the infectious phase because I've told you earlier, the infectious phase is during the first 5 days of illness, right? Okay. There is something we need to talk about in the post-infectious phase, right? So in post-infectious phase, PCR is positive but not infectious. So the COVID PCR could be positive because of live. So anytime a COVID PCR, when somebody comes and tells you my COVID-19 PCR test is positive, there are 3 possibilities. There is live virus, that means they are infectious. Can also be because we are picking up dead viruses. or we are picking up viral fragments. And so this situation here in the post-infectious period, you can see that the viral load is no longer infectious, but we are picking up the viral load. It's no longer infectious. Okay, as you can see here, the PCR remains positive. This remains, this yellow dot means positive result, white dot means negative result, right? So PCR remains positive even during the post-infectious period, but antigen test is not positive during post-infectious period. Antigen test positive is only during infectious period because it has got a lower sensitivity. So that one advantage of antigen test. So before going on to the next part, I just want to talk about CT values. What does CT values mean, right? Okay. So when we put a sample into the PCR machine, what the PCR machine does is it takes the viral fragments that is there in the swab and keeps on multiplying it many times until the fluorescence, there is enough fluorescence in the sample to be picked up by the machine, right? Okay. So imagine there is a lot of virus in the swab that you took and you are putting it in the machine, right? So it has to multiply only 14 times before the level of the sample in the machine is high enough for the PCR to be picked up. So the CT value is 14. Imagine the amount of virus in the swab is extremely small. Then what happens? The machine has to multiply many times, up to 38 times before the sample is large. The virus in the fluorescence is large enough for the machine to pick it up. So if you have a lot of virus in the sample, then the CT value will be low. If there is very little virus in the sample, the CT value can be high. CT value will be high. And so low CT value means high viral load. High CT value means low viral load. This is why it happens this way, right? Okay. So when you look at all the antigen tests that are available, when the CT value is low, that means high viral load, most of them will be positive. If the CT value is high in the sample, so CT value is detected by PCR, the CT value is high, that means low viral load, okay? Then all the antigen tests do not perform very well. There will be false negative. They'll be falsely negative. Only even though the patient has got COVID-19, it is falsely negative, okay? So that's the drawback of an antigen test over a PCR test. So antigen test does very well in low CT value or high viral load specimens, doesn't do very well in low viral load specimens, okay? So antigen tests are sensitive to pick patients who have got high viral load. When does somebody have a high viral load? They have a high viral load during pre-symptomatic phase, just before somebody gets symptoms. I'll just go back a bit to show that thing here. As you can see here, symptoms are starting here, right? Symptoms are starting here. Just before the symptoms are starting, the viral load goes up. Okay, viral load goes up. And so in the pre-symptomatic phase, we generally say it is 24 to 48 hours before the onset of symptoms. In the pre-symptomatic phase, your viral load is high. Okay, so pre-symptomatic phase, early in the symptomatic phase, that means up to 5 days from symptom onset, your viral load is high, then antigen test is very useful. And any patients who got a low CT value less than 25, again, antigen test is very useful. Okay. And so the other point we have to remember, antigen tests were developed for testing in symptomatic persons. So it has not currently been recommended for asymptomatic person because no antigen kit has been tested very well in asymptomatic persons. Sometimes we do use that in asymptomatic persons when we do mass screening. But if you take an individual patient that comes into your clinic, so antigen tests are designed for symptomatic person, not designed for asymptomatic person. And I will explain that a bit later in the diagram, right? Okay, so with these, I just go through the same theory that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to apply it in different scenarios, and these actually from US CDC guidelines, right? Okay, so if somebody is symptomatic, comes to you, okay, and in a current setting in Malaysia where the chance of them having COVID is extremely high, and so symptomatic, and they have a epidemiological history, then antigen test positive, then they are considered infected with COVID. If the antigen test is negative, it does not mean they are not COVID positive, because I've showed you earlier, antigen test negative patients can have uh, uh, low viral loads. Okay, so antigen negative, and if they're symptomatic, you might have to do NAT to before you can say they are not COVID positive. Okay, you do a PCR, then they are infected with COVID. They are infected with COVID, right? If NAT is negative, but there are known contact of a confirmed case, then you can only say currently you don't have infection, because you need to consider the window period. Because today they can be negative, but because they have not finished the window period, they have not finished 10 days or 14 days post contact, they can be still positive later. So you just have to say you have no current evidence of infection. Just before the window period ends, test again. But if you are not a known contact, then of course you have not COVID positive. Next scenario, you're asymptomatic, but you come with a close contact with a COVID-19 patient. Asymptomatic, but you have got a close contact. Then if antigen test positive, you might have to confirm it with COVID with a NAT test, because it's asymptomatic close contact. Confirm with a PCR. If PCR is positive, they are COVID positive. If the PCR is negative or antigen test is negative, then again same problem. You need to consider the window period. Look at the incubation period, look at the date of last contact, and then decide whether this person is off the incubation period or not. Okay. Last scenario is asymptomatic person, no known exposure, just comes for a COVID test. If it's antigen positive, you need to confirm this with a PCR. If antigen negative or PCR negative, they are not infected with COVID-19 results. And so you have to look at it based on symptoms and contact. The next thing you have to ask is, if the asymptomatic, you have to ask yourself, is he close contact of a COVID-19 patient? Then you need to consider the window period. The other small thing I want to mention here is for molecular tests, you can use saliva tests, but you cannot use saliva for antigen test. Okay, you can use saliva for PCR, and Ministry of Health has approved saliva for PCR tests, and so you're not necessary for you to take a swab. You can take a saliva test, right? Okay. In fact, there are many studies. There's one particular study I'm showing you done in US. It looked at nasopharyngeal swab, saliva, and nasal swabs, and they found that similar sensitivity. They were all similar sensitivity, and so saliva is just as good. But your lab, your private lab, you have to ask some private labs whether they will offer saliva tests, and then they have to give you a kit, a proper kit for you to do saliva. And some labs use deep throat saliva. You have to say and then take out the specimen out. Some labs will say drool the saliva out. So you just have to collect the saliva in the bottom of your mouth and then spit it out. So different labs have got different saliva collection method. So you have to use the respective saliva collection method, and you can use saliva for COVID-19. But remember, saliva test is approved only for PCR tests. There's very few saliva tests approved for antigens. I know SD Bioline has got a antigen test kit that is approved for saliva. So you cannot use any antigen test kit and use saliva, because the yield is very poor. Okay, so I told you we need to diagnose early because we need to stop the spread of the disease, right? Another reason why we need to diagnose early is because it is easier for us to treat a patient when they come to us early. Okay, so I will just briefly summarize the treatment approach that we use in treating COVID-19, right? Okay, this so just before that, so I just want to show you one more diagram, one more data that we have on risk of getting severe disease. So this data from our own cohort of the first 6,000 patients that we had in the country, right? So what is the risk of getting severe disease? What do we mean by severe disease? Severe disease means somebody who has who requires supplemental oxygen, category 4 or category 5 disease. Okay, so imagine somebody is less than 40 with no comorbids. That is a reference. So compared to somebody who is less than 40 with no comorbids, if you're a less than 40 with comorbids, okay, with comorbids, the chance of you getting severe disease is 8 times higher. The relative risk is 8.6. Okay, so if somebody is 51 to 60 years old, and they have diabetes or hypertension or something like that, the chance of them getting severe disease is 25 times higher compared to somebody who has got less than 40 without comorbids. Okay, so similarly, if somebody is 75 years old, even if they are healthy, no comorbids, nothing of that sort, their risk of getting severe disease is 35 times higher compared to somebody less than 40 without comorbids. And if they have comorbids, many of the old people have comorbids, the risk of getting severe disease is 50 times higher. So you have to use these risk graphs to convince older people to go for vaccination, because the risk for them is extremely high for them to get severe disease. And with our shortage of beds, the risk of having an adverse outcome is even higher with such surges, right? Okay. So coming on to how we treat COVID-19, right? So this is how we understand pathophysiology. This is how we understand pathophysiology of COVID-19. So early in the disease, we think predominant symptoms are because of the virus. Later in the disease, the predominant symptom is because of host inflammatory response. Okay. And I put in the clinical category into this particular graph, right? Okay. So as you can see here, when somebody comes to us in the first week of illness, clinical category 1 or 2, they're either asymptomatic or flu-like symptoms. Majority of them are just viral response going on, right? When they start getting pneumonias, and the chest X-ray starts showing opacities, there's a bit of post-inflammatory response starting on. And if they start requiring nasal prong or face mask, we call them category 4. When they get category 4, the post-inflammatory response is predominant. There is hardly any virus left. There are some patients who come to us with face mask, high flow mask, or even intubated or on NIV, non-invasive ventilation. Then there is no more virus left. The predominant is actually host inflammatory response. That's what happens there, right? And so what we do is so the same diagram, same picture, I'm showing you a different method. So this is a viremic phase. The virus comes down, and then the host inflammatory response starts a bit later in the day, right? In parallel to the host inflammatory response, the oxygen saturation also drops. And so what we do is we try to pick up this phase early. We want to pick up the patients at this phase. I just want to point out to you that you want to treat the pulmonary phase early, when they start getting oxygen saturation down and inflammatory response up. But you cannot take the treatment here and apply it here. So don't start steroids early, because I'm mentioning here the host inflammatory response is a predominant problem. So don't start steroids here, because if you start steroids here, the inflammatory response will be even more strong. Never give steroids in somebody who has got a viral phase. The steroids have to be started only during the pulmonary phase, right? Okay. So we pick up the presence of pulmonary phase by using oxygen saturation by inflammatory response. Sorry. And so the oxygen saturation, we check SpO2, and we also do something called 1 minute sit and stand test. How do we do the test? We ask the patient to sit and stand for 1 minute, and then we look at the SpO2 before and after. The SpO2 drop is more than 3%, then we think they have 1 minute sit and stand test positive. But 1 minute sit and stand test is not useful if patient clearly tells you I've got exertional dyspnea, then no point. It's also not useful when the SpO2 is already low. Or of course, you cannot do in somebody who's immobile, or somebody who's got advanced pregnancy or cannot sit and stand, you cannot do. But no point doing the test, the patient's already hypoxic, or no point doing the test, patient tells you already I've got exertional dyspnea. But other patients, you can do 1 minute sit and stand test to pick up the drop in oxygen saturation early. The inflammatory response we pick up by two methods. We look at the CRP, we look at rising CRP, or a single CRP more than 50, we consider it as high. The other method that we look for inflammatory responses, we look at neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. Remember in dengue, you have seen the full blood count in dengue. In full blood count in dengue, if you see the differential count, the percentage neutrophil will be 45% or 50%. While percentage lymphocyte will be 20% or 30%. So if you calculate the neutrophil count divided by lymphocyte count, the NLR ratio will be very small. But what happens when the inflammatory phase kicks in COVID-19? So when the inflammatory phase kicks in COVID-19, what happens? The percentage neutrophils start going up, the percentage lymphocyte starts dropping. And so neutrophil divided by lymphocyte, the NLR ratio starts going up. So NLR of more than 3.13 is considered poor prognosis, and so as a marker of inflammatory phase. So we pick up inflammatory phase by looking at the oxygen saturation and also looking at the CRP. And if CRP is not available, we look at the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. So sometimes I just look at the percentage neutrophil. The percentage neutrophil, does it look like viral or does it look like bacterial? If it looks like bacterial, that means we're already reaching the inflammatory response phase. And inflammatory response phase, we give early steroids and try and stop it. But what is happening now is we start seeing patients here. We are starting to see patients coming in on arrival. They already need a face mask. They already need face mask or high flow mask, and their CRP, it's not 50, but it's 200. CRP is already 200. That means they are very late in the inflammatory phase they come in. So such patients, we might have to intubate them in order to help them better. So we want to pick them up here for clinical management. We don't want to pick them up here, right? So, and also when I talk about steroids, I'm very concerned that some people will start steroids in the viremic phase. Never start steroids in viremic phase, because if you start steroids in viremic phase, they have a very more severe inflammatory response. Okay. So this is how we risk stratify our patients, putting all together what I told you just now, right? So we risk stratify based on age and comorbids. Less than 40 with no comorbids, we don't expect much problems. If less than 40 with comorbids, or 40 to 60 without comorbids, there will be some people who go into problems, but 40 to 60 with comorbids, or more than 60 without comorbids, very likely they will go into problems. If somebody is asymptomatic, they are less likely to go into problems, but they have persistent symptoms: fever, lethargy, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, chest tightness or chest pain, persistent cough, dropping absolute lymphocyte count. If you just do a full blood count, dropping absolute lymphocyte count, or NLR is increasing, then they create problems, right? Persistent cough is a bit of a problem, because some people can also have persistent cough during recovery phase. And so anybody who's symptomatic, then again, the risk of them progressing to bad disease is very high. A rising CRP or a single CRP more than 50, or 1 minute sit and stand test, more than a 3% drop in SpO2, we are concerned. And of course, this is an emergency. If somebody is hypoxic with exertional dyspnea, with a complaint of exertional dyspnea, respiratory rate 25 beats per minute, SpO2 less than 95%, abnormal vitals, or worsening extensive chest X-ray changes. All this, of course, is bad prognostic sign. You can also ask me why do people come in late? Why can't they come in earlier? Because you feel short of breath. In COVID-19, we are seeing a phenomenon that is called happy hypoxia. What do you mean by happy hypoxia? The patients, even though they're hypoxic for some unknown reason, we have a lot of theories, but for some unknown reason, they are hypoxic, but their work of breathing is not high. And they seem comfortable, but when you put an SpO2, we find the SpO2 is 90%. But they are comfortable. They say, doctor, no problem, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. They do an SpO2, it's 95%. That's the reason why many people come to us very late, because of this term called happy hypoxia. Okay, that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh. I think you have taken us through the details about early diagnosis, testing, and also looking into why the need for early detection. And I believe there'll be a lot of questions being asked by the GPs. And then I think we'll go straight into the Q&A. And probably I'll ask Dr. Siva to start asking some questions to you.
So the first question, Dato, if in a clinical setting we have FPC machine, and if I encounter a patient in stage 2, does it help to give a loading dose of steroid, either IM or
that's my biggest concern, you see, that we start giving steroids because we want to help the patient, but you might end up giving, the UK recovery study taught us how to use steroids, right? So UK recovery study showed that giving steroids in somebody is hypoxic is life-saving. But if you give somebody who is not hypoxic, it is actually harmful. Never give steroids to somebody in COVID-19 if they are not hypoxic. If you give steroids in a non-hypoxic patient, it actually harms them. What you're doing now is you're giving steroids to a guy who's actually in the viral phase. So most patients in COVID-19 during the viral phase, the body's immune system will control it. And so he doesn't go into the inflammatory phase. But giving steroids during the viral phase, what you're doing is you're canceling his immune system. And so you're canceling his immune system. So you're converting a young guy to an old man, an 80-year-old man. And so he's bound to get a severe disease if he's not planning, if he's not destined to get severe disease. By giving him steroids, you're making sure he'll get a severe disease. So never give steroids in somebody who's not hypoxic.
how about the early initiation of Montelukast, Dato?
Montelukast has not shown to be useful in COVID-19. So we all of us, we are seeing patients now in ICUs and a lot of patients. So there is a desire for us to do something to prevent them from getting into severe disease. I can understand the rationale, but unfortunately we don't have a drug because none of the antivirals that we have used so far is powerful enough. People say ivermectin is powerful enough, but it's not been shown in severe disease. People have used ivermectin, people have used vitamin C, people have used all sorts of treatment, but none of them is useful reliably enough in early disease. There is little we can do to prevent somebody from getting severe disease. All we can do is we can pick them up early and treat them early. The complications of the severe disease, complications of the disease, which is what we call a severe disease. Because as you can see here, nobody gets severe viral pneumonia. Most people get a host inflammatory response to the pneumonia, and so it's a complication of COVID-19. So what in our hospital, what we're doing is we are managing this complication early. We can never prevent the complication.
if a patient we categorize as no current evidence of infection, i.e. the window period, what's our advice to the patient for repeat tests? How many days later, or when we repeat, do we repeat RTK or PCR?
So if somebody is a close contact of confirmed case, and we are now want to pick up whether they are positive or not, we want to now decide whether they have infection or not, right? Okay. So the best method, of course, is we have learned this from travelers and all that. So our isolation period now is 10 days. So we are saying now, if you come in contact with anybody who's COVID positive, you need to isolate yourself for 10 days. So you do one test immediately, and the next test you do 2 days, within 2 days before the end of your isolation period. Meaning so if it is day 10, you should do anywhere after day 8. 2 days before the end of the isolation period, right? Okay. PCR test or antigen test doesn't matter as long as the test comes back within 24 hours. If the test is going to take 2 to 3 days to come back, you better do an antigen test. So the best test is a test that comes back immediately. In fact, if you look at it, if you have 10-day isolation period, right? Okay. So if you can do an antigen test as day 9 or day 10, good enough. It is actually a better test. Imagine you do a PCR test at day 7 or day 8, and then the results come back 3 or 4 days later. It is a lousy test. Antigen test or PCR test doesn't matter. It is a turnaround time that matters.
One of the biggest problem in the, I think, GP settings is to persuade the patient to do the testing, the COVID screening. When we suspect COVID infection, but the patient refuses to take the test, what can we do?
Yeah. So we are now trying to get ministry, sorry, not ministry, MKN, to ask whether we can now subsidize the tests and see whether we can whether they can subsidize the test, right? And that will go a long way in convincing patients to do the test, right? Okay. The second method, of course, is that's why I'm proposing that doing antigen test can be a good measure, right? And if you want, you can always use the antigen test. I think SD Bioline has got a test that uses saliva. You know, there's one, I think at least 1 or 2 kits. We are trying to get more of these kits that uses saliva as antigen test. So using saliva-based antigen test is another option. It is saliva PCR test is cheaper than antigen test is cheaper than saliva test, and we do saliva-based antigen test because the PPE cost goes off. The kit itself is cheaper than a PCR, and so those are the other methods that you can look at. That is one method. The second, of course, giving him advice to stay at home until his symptoms subsides. That's another option, and giving him MC and stuff like that. The worst thing that he can do is have the symptoms and go around to crowded places. And so we probably have to do some sort of a harm reduction in these patients.
So, can you just elaborate further on the NAAT, nucleic acid amplification test? That you mentioned earlier that this is antigen positive or negative.
Repeat the question again. Sorry.
Okay, they want to know further details on the NAAT test that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. NAAT, right. So actually, I think NAAT is just a fancy term, lah. So don't get worked up with it. So now, last time we only had PCR test, right? We had a PCR test finished. Now we have one more test called LAMP test, LAMP test. What it does is it amplifies the RNA of the virus using a different technology compared to a RT-PCR test. And so these two tests are combined to call NAAT, nucleic acid amplification test. These are a group of tests that amplify the viral RNA. Contrast to an antigen test, which does no amplification. NAAT test amplifies. So that's all. NAAT test includes the RT-PCR test and a LAMP-based test like In Abbott has got an ID now. It's a rapid PCR test that you can put into a cartridge and the results come back within an hour. And so that is also called, all these together are called NAAT tests. And so it is just putting it all together.
Okay, there's another question. How and or what to do for the new variant that does not have symptoms but have severe disease form with false test PCR, false negative PCR?
We don't have that yet. I think there are some people say in India they have such strains. We have not seen such strains in Malaysia yet so far. Because remember, when we do PCR, we look at two places, two PCR spots. And so we have not picked up any, we have not picked up in a big way patients who have COVID positive, but the PCR is negative. So I don't think we have that variant, and I don't think that's a big problem.
So there's one clinical question of this. Let's say a gentleman on day 3 of infection CRP is 30, and then on day 6 infection CRP dropped to 8.1. Does this gentleman might face the cytokine storm after the day 8?
So we do it a few ways, right? We look at it based on age. I showed you the risk group, right? Less than 40, 40 to 60. We based on the risk group, you can decide what are the chance of him going into the inflammatory phase. That is one method. The second method is, of course, looking for symptoms. If the patient is completely asymptomatic, we all get flu, right? Isn't it? We get a flu, fever, body ache, and one fine day you can tell yourself the flu has gone away because the body ache has gone away, your energy levels are back, even if your appetite is poor last time, your appetite is back. So if a patient can tell you all these things are happening at day 7, day 8, this patient will not go into inflammatory phase because his symptoms are gone. But if the patient at day 7, day 8 is still symptomatic, meaning he still has body ache, he still doesn't feel great, he still has poor appetite, he still has some chest pain, headache, and all this stuff. This person is still symptomatic at day 7, day 8. These patients are more likely to go into inflammatory phase. So clinically, you can decide whether somebody is more likely to go to inflammatory phase or non-inflammatory based on 2 parameters. One, his risk group, age and comorbids. Second, based on whether he's still symptomatic at day 7, day 8, or symptoms have gone away. Okay. And then only CRP should come in. CRP should not come in front. So you doing a CRP in front before all these things looks like you're doing a Western blot for HIV before doing ELISA is very confusing. So never do that. Go by risk group, symptom, and then look at CRP. And then you look at CRP going up, then there is a marker. If a guy is very well and the CRP fluctuates, I don't know what it means.
So there's 2 questions, but I think they're interrelated. First is the COVID-19 being a viral infection. Why should neutrophils get elevated in the inflammatory phase instead of lymphocytes being predominant? And related to that, looking into the elevation of neutrophils, is it warranted then to start antibiotics?
Okay, so I mean, you have to remember the neutrophil count is not elevated. We are talking about a relative issue. So I'm not saying neutrophil count is high. I'm saying neutrophil lymphocyte ratio is high, right? So the white cell count is still very low in these patients, right? It's not high. So that is what is unique about COVID. So it starts with a viral phase. So the full blood count looks typically like the differential count looks like dengue. And then later when the inflammation kicks in, it starts looking like a bacterial disease just based on differential count. So don't expect the white cell count to be very high, 10,000, 20,000. The white cell count will be 2,000, 3,000. But the differential count, that's why you say neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. The neutrophil lymphocyte ratio starts looking like a bacterial infection because the inflammation kicks in.
Then is there any role of starting antibiotics at all?
Yeah, correct. So this is because of inflammation, not because of bacterial infection. So it's because of inflammation. So there's no role for antibiotics in this patient. But if somebody comes to us very ill in the hospital with COVID-19 and a hypoxic, we do add antibiotics if the CRP is high, but it is not necessary to routinely give antibiotics in these patients. So when the NLR is going up, you probably have to think of referring to us already, because there is a marker of inflammatory phase. But no need routine antibiotics for this patient because the white cell count will be normal.
Inhaled budesonide, Doctor.
Huh?
Any role of inhaled budesonide?
Yeah, that's again something that people have quoted, but we don't use it in Malaysia, and we don't think there is a role for it yet, because as you can see, as you might know, in Malaysia we initially used Kaletra as an antiviral for COVID-19. Later we used hydroxychloroquine. Now we are using favipiravir, right? And so that also we are not sure whether it really works or not, right? And so we are doing a clinical trial now. So in COVID-19, what happens? 80% of the patients get better with time. And so when you use any drug, 80% of the chance you will get better. And so that's the reason why COVID bluffs us a lot. And so that's why there are a lot of drugs available currently for COVID-19. Because when we use them, patients get better. We think the drug made a difference. But actually, when you do it in a randomized controlled trial setting, even without the drug, with the drug or without drug, it's the same. So I believe budesonide is also a similar concept. So people are using it because they think they can prevent the inflammatory phase. You cannot prevent the inflammatory phase. You can only treat the inflammatory phase. For you to prevent the inflammatory phase, you need a very good antiviral drug. We don't have it yet. So budesonide as a different way of trying to prevent the inflammatory phase by giving steroid inhalers. It seems logical, but it doesn't work.
No, how about aspirin, Doctor?
So aspirin, because there's a lot of clotting that happens in COVID-19, some people think aspirin, statins are useful, but clinical trials currently have not shown benefit in both these drugs yet. And so aspirin and statins are not routinely recommended in COVID-19 currently.
Okay, this is one practical issue that we have in our GP setting. And nowadays, since a lot of GPs are doing community testing, and we do get lots of patients who are coming in because of close contacts, and many of them are asymptomatic as well. So if they say they are close contact, what is it? And some more, the other thing is that RT-PCR is also a bit costly. So looking into the cost consideration and also this the weightness and also the COVID-19. So what would you advise me to us the best day to do a RT-PCR?
So what you're trying to say is you're asking when do you do the test so you get maximum yield, isn't it? So
Yeah.
because you can just get away with one test, right? In an asymptomatic person, the most important modality is isolation, not testing. So if the guy can tell you, I am a close contact, somebody comes to me and says, I'm a close contact, doctor, I don't have much money, I can't do anything. Thing says, can you stay at home in a home isolation for 10 days? If you can do that, good enough. You don't need a test. What's the point of diagnosing an asymptomatic person if you can isolate during the most dangerous period? Isolate yourself. So my biggest advice for any, so that's the reason why I know ministry for a while said they don't want to test asymptomatic people. Everybody got very angry. But the trick is not in testing them. The trick is to isolate them. So most important issue is isolation. If the guy can isolate himself, no need to do tests. Okay. So the other way of doing, if he can isolate himself, then if you want to still do the test, you do the test 2 days before the end of isolation period. That's one method. If you want to do a test during his peak, that means it is about day, as I showed you earlier, most people become positive day 5 to day 6. So day 5 to day 6 is the median time where people become positive. That could be one option, day 5 or day 6. or you can say, I will do the test 2 days before the end of isolation period.
Day 6 of exposure, Dr. Yeah?
After exposure, that is the median time where the person becomes PCR positive, the most highest chance.
Dato, okay, now, as we are aware, there are 100 over GPs have given the Surat Kuasa to issue quarantine order. And now looking at the recent announcement by KKM that, the younger age groups are also getting severe disease, can go to category 3 and 4. So now what would your advice be to this group of GPs? And also we believe that many more will join. And then what we notice is that the what do you call it? The monitoring is all done manually. It means there are a piece of paper that we're going to write down all the details. And there's no centralized system for us to do that. So what would your advice be to those doctors who are involved in the home monitoring?
Yeah, I mean, we do say young people are more like are getting severe disease, but still they don't bypass the symptoms. So don't believe people are have got no symptoms and suddenly they deteriorate. It is just that we were not good enough to pick it up. So my suggestion will be is to go back to the symptoms that we ask, symptom screen that we ask everybody, and then ask about hypoxia. These are two things. Of course, if a patient buys a pulse oximeter, then it'll be great. If you can start selling pulse oximeter to patients, that'll be great. So pulse oximeter is the most reliable because I've told you about happy hypoxia. And some people are still hypoxic, right? So what I will do is, the hypoxia usually starts at anywhere from after day 7 of illness. That's where the hypoxia, the inflammatory phase starts after day 7 of illness, day 7 to day 12. This is the time most of them get inflammatory phase, right? Okay. So what I will do is, if the patient is still symptomatic after day 7 or day 8 of illness, I will get worried. If necessary, I might ask him for a face-to-face examination, face-to-face examination to look at him if he's still symptomatic day 7 or day 8. Otherwise, I will keep on asking him repeatedly questions about exertional hypoxia. If he has exertional hypoxia, I want to pick him up early, right? These are two things that I am. And I just want to point out to you that Hospital Sungai Buloh, along with family medicine specialists and University Malaya, ID physicians and primary care units, we have come up with a very good teaching module that teaches you how to ask these questions over the phone. And I encourage all of you to go through that module, which you can access it at any time. And it actually gives you 11 CPD points in addition to that. And so please go through. I think Dr. Arasu will send you the link. Please go through the teaching module. If you go through a teaching module, you'll be well equipped to do HSO. In fact, I feel the teaching module is a compulsory learning before you do HSO.
Thank you, Doctor. We will email blast and share with all the groups on that teaching module just mentioned, Doctor. Doctor, one question. You see, there are 30 over brands test kits government has approved. See, so we as GPs on the ground, we're also very concerned. Even though they say whatever test is all 100%. In reality, when we start using this test, we also have so much of worry whether is this really as per claimed or as per the studies. So what would your advice be to us? What are the criteria that we should look at when we start using these test kits?
Yeah, I didn't know there are 30 over antigen kits available in the country already, right? Okay. I think some of the kits are verified by IMR, but I can understand IMR cannot verify all the kits, right? So antigen kits by and large, okay. Remember, antigen kits do not multiply do not amplify the viral particles, okay. While PCR or NAT test amplifies the viral particles, okay. And so the swab the amount of virus in the swab is extremely important antigen test. And so your swabbing technique has to be extremely good. So putting a nasopharyngeal swab, leaving it there for a while, rotating it, and then taking it out. So your swabbing technique is extremely important when you do an antigen test, because a lousy swab will also end up with a negative antigen test. So it is more important than a PCR test, because in PCR we are amplifying it. So and so it's okay. And it's just we're not amplifying. So it's that's rule number one, right? And then the second thing is, of course, remember, as I showed you just now, a negative antigen test in a high risk patient, a symptomatic person who has got a close contact, doesn't rule out COVID. So sometimes you might have to say, I can't rule out a COVID test. You should still do a PCR later if you're still symptomatic. So remember that antigen test can be false negative.
So this is another question for one of our participants. What to advise for a company if one of the staff is diagnosed COVID positive with mild symptoms after 2 weeks of quarantine, with supportive mentioned, how should we advise the company to take back the staff?
So he is COVID positive. He
Yeah.
spends 2 weeks isolation.
Yes.
He is no longer infectious, but he can remain, the cough, the tiredness, all can continue. Doesn't matter, he can go back to work. He's no longer infectious, because after 10 days, he's no longer infectious.
If the patient, if the staff is positive but asymptomatic, obviously he's will be quarantined for 10 days. Is it necessary for him to do another test before going back?
Yeah, as I showed you earlier, most transmission happen within the first 5 days. After that, hardly any transmission happens, right? And so we tend to do 10 days isolation period. But if he's going to the European CDC guideline says your isolation period for mild disease is 10 days. But if the person is going into a close confined setting, he has to work in a close confined setting, or he work in like something like a prison or an institution, they say you can extend up to 14 days. But after 14 days, it's not necessary. That's all. He goes back to work. Don't do repeat PCR, nothing. No point doing PCR, because I showed you in the graph, right? The PCR remains positive for a long time, but they are not infectious.
Something which is, I think, very relevant now, as most Malaysian, quite a number of Malaysians have been vaccinated now, including the healthcare workers. What happens if they come to close contact with a positive patient? First, do we have to do the testing, COVID screening on them? Second thing, do they have to undergo the quarantine?
So I will talk about the science, and then I will talk about what our plans is. The science says if a vaccinated person gets COVID, is exposed to COVID, the chance of him getting COVID infection is lower, number one. Even if he gets COVID infection, it is usually asymptomatic. Even if, and it's asymptomatic and the CT value is high, that means they're less likely to transmit the disease. So I repeat again, if somebody is vaccinated, the chance of them getting infection is lower. And even if they get infection, usually the infection is asymptomatic, and the infection is accompanied by high CT values. That means they are less likely to transmit the infection to others. That's a science that we have. US CDC now says if a public person is vaccinated and is exposed to COVID-19 and remains asymptomatic, no need quarantine, no need test. That's what US CDC says. No need quarantine, no need test, as long as they're asymptomatic. The Malaysia has just released a healthcare worker guideline, because our public vaccination is still not very high. Healthcare worker guideline that says if a healthcare worker is exposed to COVID, fully vaccinated, when I say fully vaccinated, it means 2 weeks after completing the second dose. Fully vaccinated means 2 weeks after completing the second dose. Anything earlier means you have to follow the same guidelines as non-vaccinated person. So if it's fully vaccinated, the current healthcare worker guideline says no need to quarantine anymore. But if it's a high risk exposure, meaning he was exposed at home or exposed without any PPE at all, then we recommend continue the test as before. The last time we have advised healthcare worker testing is do a test at day 3 and do a test at day 8. Day 3 and day 8. So do the testing, but no need quarantine. So I repeat again, the healthcare worker is fully vaccinated. Fully vaccinated means 2 weeks after the second dose. After fully vaccinated is exposed, you have to see high risk exposure, low risk exposure. High risk exposure means in the hospital or clinic, exposure without PPE. I hope it doesn't happen. Or exposure at home. So if the high risk exposure, what you do is you don't need to quarantine, but test yourself at day 3 and day 8. Or test yourself at any time you become symptomatic.
So this is a scenario that some of us we do face. When we do a PCR test at one place, today they do a PCR test, then it's negative, and then all could be positive, and then they do it again probably the same day at a different place, and then it becomes vice versa. So how do we advise this particular, especially layman, on this scenario?
Yeah. So usually it happens because in such the positive, if I look at the positive COVID result, the CT value will be very high, 39, 38, or 40. It will be in that values, right? If it is that kind of values, what we do is he could be false positive. That's the reason why it is sometimes positive, sometimes negative, and the CT value is very high, so it's false positive. In situations like this, that's one false positive. Or second possibility is he actually had the infection 3 weeks ago, and now we are dealing with a very low viral load, and so that's why it's sometimes positive, sometimes negative. Two possibilities, right? So I don't think it is right to send him to quarantine, because if he doesn't have COVID, he go to a MIPS, he will get COVID. And so I don't think it's right to send to COVID. So my suggestion will be is to isolate if you can, if either we say you're COVID negative because your PCR is not repeatedly positive, especially if the other CT value is very high, the positive one CT value is very high, I will say not COVID. Or if he has a lot of risk factors, then I will say this could be, early infection or late infection. I will ask him to isolate himself for a while.
This is about the vaccination. If the patient had a COVID, already had a COVID, CDC recommends vaccination again. However, Dr. Peter McCall says a natural COVID infection confers permanent immunity against all variants, and vaccination could trigger a cytokine storm. What's your take on this, sir?
There's a lot of issues with vaccination, isn't it? Right? Okay. So so what happens is after an infection, there is a Danish study, a study done in Denmark, which showed that after a natural infection, especially in older people, more than 60, 65 years old, many people have the immunity wanes off. Immunity wanes off in many of them in older people. So they're no longer protected. So they get recurrent infections. And so when you get natural infections, your immunity is variable. Some of them it goes away, some of them it remains positive, remains immune for a long time, right? Majority of them, the protection is there for 3 months. Beyond 3 months, we don't know, right? Okay. So when I vaccinate all these people, then what happens? We are putting them all in the same group. So later we will know, because we are doing studies on vaccinated people, we will know whether they need booster after 1 year, they need booster after 3 years, we will know. After natural infections, we don't know because there is so much variability. Maybe some are protected, maybe some are not protected. We don't know. So I cannot promise you anything because I can't give you a figure. Okay. So that's the reason why we are encouraging vaccinated people infected people to get vaccinated. But infected people are getting vaccinated. Some people say their immune response is very high after the first dose. In most of us, when we take the vaccination, our second dose felt stronger than the first dose. In a person who's infected, the first dose will feel strong because it is for them a second dose. Some people argue they don't need 2 doses. They just need 1 dose. But I believe all infected persons should take at least 1 dose of vaccination, at least 1 dose. But current CDC recommendation says even infected persons should get 2 doses. But at least 1 dose is absolutely necessary.
Just one final one though. Is there a duration that they have to wait before they get the vaccination after infection?
Our first guideline that we sent out in Ministry of Health, we wanted to vaccinate as many high-risk people as possible. High risk of getting COVID-19. A high risk of getting COVID-19 is someone who has never got COVID before. Somebody who has got COVID before is low risk of getting COVID-19. So we said, wait for all those who are infected, please wait for 3 months so that the high-risk people who have never got COVID get their vaccination first. So that's the reason why he said wait for 3 months. But currently we don't say anything of that sort anymore. So even if you are infected before, you can go ahead and get vaccinated as per your schedule. So you don't have to wait for 3 months.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dato. I think thank you for taking your precious time and your busy time to share your knowledge, also expertise and advise the GPs. And to the GPs out there, just hang on for a while. We will display the QR code for the CPD points. And please remember that by 30th of June, we need to have 20 CPD points to renew our APC for 2022. Okay, and most of the questions asked, Dr. Suresh has already answered. And then you can always look into the webinar and also the slides to understand better. We'll get the slides and also to share with all of you all. And then, Dato, 3 take-home message from you for us.
So I think I understand that patients sometimes don't want the test, but I think we should encourage everybody to get tested as much as possible. We need to find methods to decrease the cost of testing by using innovative methods like saliva and all that, so that we can offer more people the test. We will continue to work with the government and try and see how to subsidize the test so that GPs can do the test more often. But I encourage all of you to think of COVID and continue to do the good work that you're doing to pick up most patients early. Thank you.
Thank you, Dato. Thank you very much. Have a good day to you.
Thank you.